The title of the talk, well, so first of all, I'll begin by acknowledging that Western University, where I teach, and London, Ontario, where I live, are both located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehouk, and the Ternonton people, on Indigenous lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796. I respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have with this land as their original caretakers, and acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous people, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, continue to endure in Canada. And I ask that we recognize this painful history of genocide and forced removal, honoring and respecting the Indigenous communities still living on and connected to this land by striving for restorative justice for all Indigenous people and for all those who have been marginalized and oppressed. So, the title of the talk today is The Ethics of Emotion in Artificial Intelligence Systems. This is work that I have done with a great colleague, Jesse Hui, who is a computer scientist and artificial intelligence guy at the University of Waterloo. And I'll just bring up Jesse's photo here. There's Jesse. And it's also based on a paper that was published last year at FACT, which is the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, etc., in Machine Learning Conference. And so if you're interested in kind of the details of this argument, you're welcome to take a look at the full paper. It is open access on the ACM website. So I probably don't need to tell any of you that among the many features of our current kind of enthusiasm for artificial intelligence technologies grounded in machine learning of various sorts is an interest in what some people call artificial emotional intelligence. And what does that mean? That means a variety of things, right? It can mean simultaneously the simulation of human emotion by AI systems, or the collection and analysis of data about human emotions by AI systems. And there are various ways of doing this, and there are various kind of modalities whereby digital technologies collect this information. The most, of course, notable and probably highest profile being emotion detection and analysis via facial analysis, facial recognition identification systems. So this is of interest to me in part because I'm currently writing a historical monograph, a book on the history of how computer scientists have understood or misunderstood human emotion, going back right actually to before even the kind of invention of digital computers, electronic computers, and so it's been fascinating to see how that historical work connects with some of my kind of more contemporary work, and how many of the same conversations and I guess same sort of questions about what emotion is and how it might be understood via quantitative computational methods have really persisted over the past 60 or 70 years. I'm not going to talk that much about that historical work in the talk, but I'm happy to go into it in the Q&A period. As many of you probably know, being buried in completing a book manuscript, it's really on your brain. So happy to chat about that as need be. So there are a couple of issues with emotion that I want to flag before I sort of start digging into this work and why I, what inspired it. One problem is this question of the the question of what's the problem of parts, right? Emotions are complicated, multifaceted phenomena, right? I think we can all understand from our subjective experience as human beings, right, that they involve both physiological responses, getting flushed, things in the body, expressive and behavioral responses, how we react socially to emotions, thoughts, right, our own awareness of feelings or lack of awareness, and various other facets. And so the philosopher Jesse Prince, who's a philosopher of emotion, talks about this as the problem of parts, right? What component or components of emotion are essential to its definition and detection in any particular context, because there are lots of parts, and you can't really capture them all at once. And then the other kind of related point or problem that Prince brings up is this question of what's called the problem of plenty, right? If multiple components of emotion are essential for understanding it, how do these emotion components hang together in practice? How do they influence each other? And and of course, for quantification purposes, for computation purposes, can is one component of emotion a reliable proxy for others? And you'll see that the question of proxy for emotion is going to be really important in this talk. So, as all of you probably know, again, being folks at a major research lab, there are a variety of different proxy data forms that we can use to understand emotion, right? There's physiological data from heart rate, facial expression, skin conductivity, etc. That also shades into the behavioral data, right? Around response of the face or facial muscles. There's kind of self-reported graphic or semantic data, right? So this would be elements like the Facebook reaction icons, or even kind of sentiment analysis with dictionaries of emotion words. And then there's this whole universe of social and interactional data where you take these other proxies and try to kind of learn something from them based on in social interactions between people over time. So I'm actually going to skip this slide. I would just it's here to say that there's a kind of broader question around emotion tracking that fits into a kind of broader set of questions about what we can know about the interiority of individuals based on their exterior characteristics, right? So in some ways, I think you could lump, although in some ways not, you could lump emotion tracking and analysis and contemporary computing into a kind of broader set of techniques that I and another co-author, Jevon Hudson, have talked about as physiognomic AI. And so this is something else we could maybe talk about in questions, but there's a real danger of replicating the mistakes of physiognomy, replicating the idea that you can know certain things definitively about interior characteristics based on exterior characteristics. We really don't want to replicate those assumptions for lots of reasons in AI-based analysis. And I'm not the only person who said this. Some folks at Google wrote this really good piece, Physiognomy's New Clothes, a few years ago, and we were kind of in broad agreement. I'm just going to skip through those. So there's kind of a central question in the context of of emotion and emotion AI. Whether or not we have these different forms of proxy data, right, for what emotions are, but then there are also a number of different kind of models for how we understand emotion, how we conceptualize what emotions are in the context of human, human mental life and especially human, human theories of action and behavior and personality, right? And I think you can sort of see them as kind of roughly, and this is very a very schematic, kind of boiling down, roughly divided into two groups, right? Do we treat or understand emotion as evaluative or motivational primarily, right? So let's go into these in turn, right? Do we understand and do we treat human emotion as motivations, as motivational? So the kind of big champion for what we could call kind of motivational theories of emotion in affective science and emotion science is the work that I'm sure you're all familiar with, of Paul Ekman, right, the psychologist who in the 1970s really pioneered studies of emotion recognition in the face, right? He did a variety of studies both in the United States and then kind of cross-culturally, and claimed that emotion could be understood as a set of basically affect programs, right? So these are biological responses in the brain. They produce roughly similar responses, physiological responses across populations of the world, across all humans, and they can be narrowed down to 5 or 6 basic emotions, right? And here's an image from the mid-70s from one of Ekman's works, displaying these probably quite familiar emotions: anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, etc. It's important to note, right, that, and this is where some of the historical work that I'm doing does play into this question, that Ekman was really heavily influenced and collaborated closely with another psychologist, Sylvan S. Tompkins, who, really in his work in the 1950s and 60s, really was, basically invented this idea of affect theory and affective programs as biological, physiological kind of motivating factors in human experience. Right, and in some ways, this was meant to push back against the kind of radical behaviorism of not ever thinking about the interiority of the brain at all, right? It was also a way of trying to kind of grapple in a kind of more scientific way with drive theory from Freud and others. And finally, it was heavily influenced in ways that I think are still a bit underappreciated by the cybernetic theory of Norbert Wiener and some of the ideas about physiological ideas about emotion that came into cybernetics via its relationship with physiology and the work of somebody like Walter Cannon, if you know anything about the history of physiology. So this motivational model of emotion, which the historian Rhys Lathe calls an anti-intentionalist model, really pervades a lot of the digital artifacts that we see today online that have to do with emotion, right? The Ekman Group, partially because the Ekman Group has been extraordinarily prolific in terms of its consulting and its influence in Silicon Valley, right? And the sort of basic emotion theory work pervades artifacts like Facebook's reaction icons and many other kind of ideas about how emotion works. And you can see what the appeal of why understanding emotion as a motivational force in human behavior exists, especially in the context of computing, because it suggests, right, a kind of uniform ability to track and trace and analyze emotion based on the assumption that whatever somebody's doing, smiling or frowning or whatever, it's giving some quote unquote true representation of how they're actually feeling. And that, for lots of reasons and lots of applications in computer science, that's obviously an appealing assumption to make. Okay, so then the kind of second very broad set of kind of emotion theories or emotion ideas is, this idea of treating emotions as evaluative. And this, this, again, out of a long history of emotion and emotion work and, psychologists talking about what emotions are, right? This has a very cognitive science flavor to it. It really comes in part with appraisal theory in the 1960s. And it suggests that emotions and emotion response are a part of a broader system of cognition, right? That helps us judge the world and understand the world through emotional response. You can take this kind of really far on the cognitive side, right? And so people, talking about hot cognition and cold cognition is a way of talking about emotion without actually talking about emotion. But there's a sense, right, that this kind of cognitive science understanding of emotion, I think in some models is a more balanced approach, right? It assumes, for one thing, that emotions are always something that we have to reflect on or should be reflecting on, right? They're an element of our experience with the world. And so, this is very much a thing in social theory and some sociological work as well. So the very famous sociologist Russell Hochschild, who was one of the first people to write about what we now talk about as emotional labor, right, had this idea that every emotion is a signal function, right? That emotions are signals, much like sense impressions about the world. So in the paper that we published at FACT, Jesse and I, first of all, kind of taxonomized this whole set of types of physiological kind of proxy data collected about emotion, as well as models of emotion, right? So these kind of two big ones, motivational and evaluative. Sometimes you call it experiential. And one thing to really note is how much the motivational model persists in all sorts of different kinds of computational technologies, regardless of the kind of proxy data collected, right? So you see the motivational model in areas like facial recognition, in all sorts of emotion detection for speech, which is becoming a big area. galvanic skin response, sentiment analysis, etc. Digital models of emotion that are more evaluative are a little bit less common. There are some interesting attempts to structure AI systems, neural nets, with a kind of emotion component, like a kind of emotion module, right? That is supposed to try to mimic the role of hot cognition in human emotional response. Jesse Huey, my colleague, is very interested in something called BASACT, which tries to incorporate kind of social norms around emotional response and emotional activity into the predictive work with voice agents, for instance. But in general, right, this motivational model is much more powerful and much more present. And so I think one of the in the second part of the paper, we become really interested in and talk a lot about these questions about the kind of troubling norms, what we call the troubling norms of basic emotion theory, and sort of fundamentally why basic emotion theory as a kind of assumed ethics and assumed assumed state of human autonomy or human activity is kind of a problem, right? So as this kind of motivational theory of emotion, as I say, is very common and very popular, right? So it persists across a variety of different kind of online marketing or online firms that use these technologies, maybe the most famous being Affectiva, right, which came out of the MIT Media Lab about 10 years ago and has now been purchased by Smart Eyes, which is a big car emotion tracking company. And I think one of the things that concerns us or troubles us about the norms of basic emotion theory is this connection to this broader discussion about physiognomy and its assumptions about the interiority versus exteriority of humans. This is an image from the work of a very noted 19th century statistician and physiognomist, Sir Francis Galton. Right, and so just to give you context, what's happening here is Galton is trying to infer criminality through exterior facial features. Right, he's overlaying portraits of people who have been convicted for crimes and trying to see if their noses look all the same to kind of figure out this kind of criminal nose. And we've seen sort of similar kind of controversies around similar directly sort of physiognomic papers involving crime and criminality. This is a famous one from a few years ago. But I think we also have to think about these questions about interiority and exteriority in the context of emotion, right? This is now a somewhat dated example, but there are lots of startups and other projects that claim to do things like detect aggression, detect guilt, or detect other kind of potentially problematic negative emotions using facial recognition technology and using other technologies. And again, right, this really relies on understanding emotion as a motivational force in human behavior, right? That you can't hide your guilt, and your guilt will be displayed on your face. Those are the kind of conceptual assumptions underneath these technologies. Now, there are a bunch of issues with this, one of which, ties into a lot of the recent work in the kind of fairness and bias literature in responsible AI, which is that, like many other facial recognition systems, these technologies are not very good at interpreting the emotions of certain groups, particularly Black faces, right? This has to do in part because of training data. It has also to do with facial recognition. It also has to do with the fact that a lot of skin conductivity technologies are not calibrated for darker skin tone. And so this work is from Lauren Rue at the University of Maryland. She did a really great study where she shows how much worse the commercial face APIs are at detecting a happy smiling Black male face than a happy smiling white male face. She did this on shots of basketball players. A kind of controlled data set that so, everybody in these data sets is a male athlete smiling, and these systems are much less likely to identify the face of the black athlete as smiling than the face of the white athlete. So, right, I mean, this is not simply an academic problem, given how common a lot of these systems are becoming in areas like hiring, border security, and many others, and we could, there's a whole list. The more that these systems become used to adjudicate and judge your interior state via emotional expression, the more these problems are going to crop up. And these problems are both these kind of technical problems around whether the system is treating everybody the same way, but also more critically, these conceptual problems, right? Assuming the motivational nature of emotion when, in fact, that motivational nature of emotion is really heavily contested, right? Because here's the thing, right? Basic emotion theory does not really lend sufficient scientific evidence to a lot of the claims made by kind of facial recognition providers that these systems can really easily determine what people are really feeling, right? The kind of critiques of basic emotion theory and concerns about it go back into the 1980s and 1990s with folks like James Russell. More recently, Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern has been a kind of major proponent of different, more complex theories of how physiological affect shapes human emotional response, right? But the idea, and she did a big meta review a couple of years ago that showed that really these, this idea that there's a kind of reliable correspondence between emotive expression on the face and subjective understanding of feeling, it really just doesn't hold up. So the discourse amongst researchers, I think, is significantly more sophisticated and more nuanced, right, than the conversation that's happening often in the commercial realm, right? The way that these technologies are getting spun by marketers, and some of those claims are really very sensationalist. But again, these systems are kind of becoming highly ubiquitous, right? So another concern that we have in the paper is really how the kind of preponderance of this motivational model of emotion, how by circulating in the world, what does this belief that emotions are motivational, what effects does that have, right? The science is unclear. The science is in fact not very good, but people are very good at acting as if are shaping their behavior around their beliefs, and so right, we have a big concern that people will sort of begin to believe in these external signs or signals of emotion, and kind of understand their emotions as being motivational more than they already do. And you can see this, not just in consumer tech, but in cultural products like notably the Disney Pixar film Inside Out from a few years ago, which was also based on Ekman's basic emotion theory and has all sorts of interesting things we could say about it in terms of technology and the management of emotion. Right. So, and so, and the kind of spin-off problem with this reshaping of our own subjective understanding of emotions around motivational models is, who's asking us to do the reshaping, right? And so I think a big concern that I have with emotion is that individuals will, have to sort of preemptively start positioning themselves, and their emotional expression as being aligned with the model of platform like Facebook or other platforms, either explicitly or implicitly buys into, right? We all sort of have to kind of modulate our behavior in different social situations, and so it's people, right, who are doing the work of understanding how to be legible on social platforms and also in non-social platforms. This kind of modulation, has big impacts or big implications for political discourse, right? For conversations about in the civic sphere about how our countries and citizens want the world to be run, It's not just right that facial recognition is a great tool for oppression, as this piece by Woody Hartzog and Ryan Calo points out, but it's also that the kind of way we as individuals are shaping our emotional expression and emotional response within social media platforms is potentially having knock-on effects about civic discourse and how we communicate with each other. And there's a lot more work to be done, I think, connecting the specific affordances of social media platforms and how they cultivate emotional expression and how they collect emotional data, and some of the conversations around polarization, toxicity, and the rise of right-wing extremism that are happening in other areas of media studies right now. Which is why I've written that I think that facial recognition, especially, and I think emotion recognition, I'm becoming increasingly convinced emotion recognition is in a kind of similar way is extremely socially toxic, right? It can be analogous to plutonium. And I think ultimately, finally, in the paper, Jesse and I asked this question, right? So we have this total lack of consensus about what emotion is, and what its effects are, right? I mean, it's not that there's no consensus, but there are different camps, and the problem of parts and the problem of plenty that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, really suggest, right, that effective science itself is highly unsettled, and that the kind of with quite different sets of kind of core conceptual beliefs on different sides of the question. So I think this raises a bigger question of whether it's ever ethically appropriate to develop and deploy emotion recognition or emotion analysis systems for public consumption, right? And I'll stress here public consumption, right? Of course, right, there may be some relevant or valid reasons to do this work and for research purposes, or in particular maybe medical or mental health contexts. Tools for autistic youth are often brought up as a potential use for these technologies, but because this is such a contested area, and because of the kind of potential impacts of believing in and deploying this motivational model of emotion, I think this is a really serious ethical question that we should be grappling with. And I mean, I tend to come down on the side of that no, we shouldn't be deploying emotion recognition systems publicly. So, of course, that this is not always a popular message to convey, especially to folks doing technical work. So I'm looking forward to what will be, I'm sure, a great conversation in the second half of the seminar. So thanks so much, and I look forward to questions and further chat.